In times of trauma and adversity, we must create space for connection by sharing a story of hope. Welcome to Stories of Hope Worldwide, hosted by Kerry Atherton. This podcast shares inspiring stories of individuals who have faced significant challenges and emerged stronger, offering hope and resilience to listeners all over the world. Join Kerry, the founder of Stories of Hope, every week to hear these remarkable journeys and find strength to overcome your adversity. Now, let's listen in to this week's conversation.
Welcome to another episode of Stories of Hope Worldwide. I'm Kerry Atherton and I'm your host, and today's guest is Matthew Horder. On July 17, 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine. Matthew's parents were on board. Welcome, Matthew.
Hi, Kerry. Thanks for having me on today.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing about such a sensitive and such a life-altering traumatic event, and also honouring your parents, Howard and Suzanne, in the process. When we hear those headlines that 298 people on board were killed, that they weren't just people, they were someone's families. And so let's start by hearing a bit about your parents and who they were.
Yeah, so look, my parents were your typical average Australian family, and I say that with all due respect. They lived a pretty good life, but they grew up together almost as neighbours, a few doors down from each other in Chermside, in the outskirts of Brisbane, and ultimately, married and had a family and lived the bulk of our family life in Albany Creek, again on the northern suburbs of Brisbane. And, they were hardworking Australians who did a really good job with myself and my two brothers. There's three of us all up, and, really provided a great start for us. And I think that's a testament to how they lived their life, their contribution to the community and that sort of stuff.
Thank you for sharing that bit about them, Matthew. They sound like amazing humans, and the way that you've been able to carry on their legacy is obviously as a result of the way that they brought you up. I know that you're a community leader also in the Sunshine Coast. You've been very involved with surf lifesaving and worked in managerial roles and at a high level, and that you're somebody that's really poured out into your own community.
Yeah, look, I think it's something that I've always enjoyed. There's obviously some leadership skills in me there that come out when I do these different things. Still heavily involved with surf lifesaving, just less at the executive level, but as an active member and a lifesaver, I'm involved, and also on the board of End Ed, which is a charity on the Sunshine Coast. So they approached me to join that board. They can recognise some of my skills and abilities to support that and the development and growth of that board. And I think I enjoy doing that sort of stuff. And sometimes I sort of look at this, I go, I've been very lucky that I've been able to have a good working career and also be able to have a little bit of that time to sort of give back and do those other things. And it provides a really good balance to how you approach life in general. I also take time away from it all. I have my breaks, I do my holidays, which is what mum and dad were doing when they were away. And so, overall, I feel very balanced with the way I can contribute to community, home and work.
And it's great to have a purpose, isn't it, like that, to carry us through when we go through such traumatic times?
I think it's easy to say now, perhaps before. There's always a before and an after when you have these major events in your life, and I was always heavily involved prior. But certainly since, having that community purpose and helping others and benefiting others is very important for me, and I'm sure it would be for a lot of other people as well, where you've had something, terrible happen to you. It really is you read the headline out at the start. It's one of those things that happens to other people. All of a sudden it's happened to me. And, over time, drawing on those other different networks and parts of the community is very useful and beneficial for me as part of my personal healing. And you also approach things a bit differently too. So you have a lot more compassion and a lot more perspective on little things that sometimes we sort of take out of proportion but you can sort of bring it back to, okay, this is what's really important and we're going to do this and it's going to help somebody.
Matthew, how old were your parents?
So Dad was 63 and Mum was 62 when they passed away. They just sort of, really moved into retirement. They'd always been pretty well travelled and stuff beforehand, but this was, just a different sort of trip for them in terms of there was no other work commitments or anything else. It was, at that time of their life where they were young enough to still do things and out there doing them, which is what, you should do when you retire or whatever it is.
So there's a lot to talk about today. The actual event, what happened after the very, very long investigation, your book, which is going to be a beacon of hope to so many people that are going through trauma and grief, and the sunflowers. Now, I've got my sunflower earrings on today.
I did notice those, yes.
Somebody
Excellent.
gave me them actually when I launched my second book, and I've just always loved them, so I thought I'm going to wear them today, and we'll talk about the sunflowers a bit later. Matthew, what happened that day?
There's aspects of that day that are still very clear to me, even though that period was also a bit blurry. And so personally for me, I woke up on it was a Friday morning. I'd had several missed calls from my brothers. Prior to that, I knew that Mum and Dad were due to be travelling back and I expected home, within that 24-hour period. And so I ended up contacting my youngest brother who lived in Melbourne, and he was having trouble speaking. And I remember just sort of saying, what's going on? And he just said, look, I think Mum and Dad's planes crashed. And, the initial reaction really is almost disbelief. It's like, well, I didn't sort of joke with him, but I did sort of say, are you sure? Like, what do you mean? And while he was chatting, I'd put the TV on and the morning one of the morning shows was on, and it was the headline news and the headline story. In fact, it was the only story they were running that morning, that MH17 had crashed. And I had Mum and Dad's itinerary with me, so I was able to sort of start quickly checking, and the flight number was matching up, the date was matching up, the times were matching up. That's how I found out that the incident had occurred. And I just sort of said to him at the time, look, I'll call you back and I'll try and find out some other information, which sort of put us on to this course. I rang the consular assistance line at DFAT and eventually spoke to someone, and, information was limited at that stage, but it was all adding up that was Mum and Dad's flight. And ultimately they were confirmed as being on the manifest that same day. And I mean, it's really easy to say, but literally our lives were sort of turned upside down in a moment on that day. And it started a pretty long process. Here we are, we've just sort of passed the 12-year anniversary. So, it's been, in many aspects, a quick 12 years, but also 12 years is a long time. And we're still sort of working through stuff.
And it's a very long time when you're going through a grief tunnel.
Yeah. And look, at that stage, and as you know, there's no rules on grief or how you approach it. And everybody is different. And we can touch on that a little bit as well. But it definitely, it's not a usual death. And I sort of say that seems obvious, right? But
Yeah.
it was Mum and Dad had crashed. They were somewhere, their bodies were somewhere in eastern Ukraine, and we had no way of knowing where they were or getting them back. Or, in that moment, you felt absolutely helpless, just helpless. You couldn't start even thinking about, a funeral or whatever it is that you do when someone passes away. So we really relied a lot heavily on support from, in our case, the Australian government through DFAT and the Australian Federal Police.
I went to your book launch and we heard from a member of the Australian Federal Police. It was absolutely phenomenal book launch, and I loved the way you did it. And we were talking about that before the interview. And you actually interviewed a lot of people, which I thought you were so strong to do that on the day. And here we are, like you said, 12 years on, and you've released your book now. When did you start writing the book?
There's probably two parts to this. So I first had the idea for the book back in 2014, probably more in a jovial sense, but things were happening to us that were unusual and extraordinary, part of which I just sort of touched on in terms of, what we had to deal with.
Yeah.
And I'd always said, we got to write this down, we need to put this in a book. not so much to publish it, but there was so much going on.
Like journaling type thing. Like
Yeah,
yeah.
and just so that we didn't sort of forget. Not that you
Yeah.
ever do, but also to pass it on to the kids and whoever else needed it. And it wasn't until much later, and in fact, it was a book launch I went to for another writer in 2024, and I went, oh, they've inspired me. You know, they were similar. They'd been through some hardship. They'd had a loss of a partner, and had written a book for their child and published it. And I thought, look, this is my sort of wake up call, if you like, or whatever you want to call it. I need to sit down and start writing. So I did. I did an Ignite and Write workshop with Roxy, and that was in November 2024 that I started writing that book. And it took about 9 months for me to sort of get the guts of my book written with a lot of support of others. And then really another 9 months to sort of go through that editing, publishing process. So a significant achievement. You got it. For me, I keep saying I'm not a writer, and I can't say that anymore because
I know, I read that in your bio.
But prior to that, I think the biggest thing I'd ever written was a 3,000-word assignment at university or something like that. So, it was significant achievement personally for me as well. But I felt really good sort of getting those words out down on a page, regardless of whether I published it or not. But ultimately, we went down a path where we thought, let's publish it and put it out there.
And so, having written a couple of books myself, I know, for me, and, I suppose everyone is different. Nobody's journey is exactly the same, as you said, and yours is a very unique journey. Do you feel up to that point? Because I want to talk about what happened with the investigation and everything a bit later. But when there's things to do and things to process, it's almost like for many people, the grief is put on hold and you're not actually able to process that stuff properly. And so do you feel when you started to write the book that was a time then when you actually let yourself go and were able to grieve properly?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of aspects of what we had to do that felt like a job almost, right? This is the job of bringing mum and dad home, or this is the job of a legal proceeding, or whatever it is. And there was different things that we had to respond to there that sort of, you kind of do have to push some of that grief reaction aside. And it varies, because in those moments, sometimes that's really good. If you've got something to focus on and you've got a bit to do, it can actually help you a little bit.
Yeah.
But at some point, you still need to sort of process that grief. And there was definitely aspects of rewriting or writing about what I did that gave me that chance to sort of really let it out. And it's a weird sort of feeling, but, I'd get into some parts that were quite difficult for me, and I'd literally be crying while I was writing, but I just couldn't stop. It just kept coming.
Yeah.
And then I'd read, I'd put it aside and read it again a week later and cry again, and then put it aside and read it again later and still cry, right? So it's definitely helped me get some of that out. That's the physical sort of side of it, your body's sort of going, yeah, okay, this is sad. You need to sort of do something about that. But it's probably because some of that didn't happen at the time. It was more of like I say, the job of sort of handling all of this stuff.
Yeah. And as you were saying before about, we were talking about the grief journey. As a counsellor, I sit with so many people that have been through extreme adverse circumstances and loss, and they try and escape in so many different ways from that pain.
Yeah.
In whether that be substances, alcohol, sport, whatever it is, just to get rid of the pain. But the thing with grief is, and I know personally, having lost both my parents as well, that you can't sidestep it. And as painful as it is, you have to actually walk through that tunnel at some stage to come out the other side.
Yeah. And look, time perhaps helps a little bit. So even I think if I'd tried to write this book in 2014 or 2015 or 2016, it might have been a very different book and might have been a very, very different process. So to sort of come back to it, let's call it 10 years later and actually get it all down, I was still going through that grieving process. There's no doubt about it. But my awareness of it all was a lot better. I could sit there and go, there was one moment where I was on a train. I was commuting to Brisbane for work, and I would do some of my book on the train. And I was sitting in one of those seats where there's 4 people, and I'm bawling on the train.
Oh,
And had I done that years and years ago, I would have been really embarrassed and upset, but I didn't care. It was just like, this is okay. Like, I'm allowed to react this way, and it's okay. Like, and so time teaches you that you need to actually do it, and but you're also going to be okay as well. Like, it's important to do it. Don't bottle it up. Don't hold it back. Don't suppress it. Don't sort of push it to the side all the time. It's actually all right to sort of get it out. And generally speaking, you will feel better at the other end. It doesn't change what happened. You never get away from that, but it definitely helps every time you go through a bit of I don't know what you'd call it. You might have a term for it, but that downside of that grief cycle, it's a bit sadder, it's a bit harder,
yeah.
but you come out of it the other end better. Well, certainly I did.
Well, yeah, I call it times of processing. I did controlled grieving at a time where I could, but when my mum was dying, she was actually in palliative care for 11 months. And every time I would travel backwards and forwards, in the plane, that's a year that I still haven't really dealt with because the trauma of that year was just so great. I've
Yes.
tried, but I don't think I'll ever be able to fully go there, but I would sit on the plane as well and sometimes cry the whole trip.
Yeah.
And the kindness of strangers, whether it was that they said, "Are you all right?" or they smiled or they touched my arm, that's something that you just don't notice every day. But when you're in those extreme times of sensitivity and rawness in public, the kindness of strangers is just something that you become so grateful for.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just hearing you talk then, that traveling back for 11 months, that's kind of the job of dealing with it. So to a certain extent, you're putting some things aside. You're going to do what you need to do to, help your mum and whatever else and see her. And it is hard. At some stage, you will come back. It's the kindness of strangers is interesting because people will often genuinely be supportive and ask, and initially you don't want to unload on someone as well, so you don't really want to know, and you learn how to deal with that better as well. But it's important to sort of chat about it sometimes and just go, look, this is what I'm going through. You don't need to sort of say anything else. Yeah.
And what do they say? A problem shared is a problem halved, and it really is true. We don't know how many people out there. I mean, obviously in my work, I meet people every day.
Yeah.
And on the outside, they look like they've got it all together and everything's all shiny. But underneath, they're going through sorrow. And just me being vulnerable and allowing a little bit of my story out to them, really, you can see something on their face like, oh, I'm not alone. And not a lot has to be said,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so by me being vulnerable, I actually give other people permission then to know that it's okay to also be vulnerable and that there is hope. Even though life's never the same again, there is hope.
Yeah. I think there's an element, I'll talk about this a little bit as well, around some of that resilience, right? So when you sort of say life is never the same, and it's so true, it's not the same. Part of what I perhaps struggled with in the early years was accepting that things were going to be different. And I've learned that, there's so much of what's happened to our family that it literally cannot control. Whilst I don't agree with what happened, I kind of need to accept that I can't control that. I don't accept what happened to them and who shot them down. That will never go away. But as for my own well-being, I need to sort of go, okay, I can't really control that. But what are the things I can control? What are the things that I can do that makes a difference? And that ultimately is that little bit of hope that keeps you going. And so that's kind of what I do. So often if I sort of fall back, and it's okay to fall back as well, I will say that.
That's right.
It's a place that I kind of don't want to live in permanently. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this because I know it helps me or it helps someone else. And it's perhaps accepting some of what happened is I just can't change.
And you really have hit a pertinent point there, because it's so easy, isn't it, when you're going through the pain, and I meet so many people who are, to fall into that victim mentality, and some people don't have the assistance or the resilience to get back up.
Yeah.
So they stay in their pain for the rest of their life. But I guess, I've learnt the art of falling back into the pain, but realising that, yes, we have to process bit by bit to get through that to the other side. But like you said, we don't have to stay there. And that's so important on the journey of recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. Personally, so writing my book and writing down the story really helped me realise that about myself. And I started to sort of jump into, some of my childhood and growing up. And one of the things that happened to me when I was 7 was I had open heart surgery. And I thought, this is a significant thing. I'll write about it. And I did. And as I was writing, I was like, well, I had this major medical procedure. I've still got the scar to prove it. And I came through that out the other end.
Yeah.
And there was other little things along the way. And I was like, these are all the little things that perhaps have helped build my resilience. And in a roundabout way, I was sort of almost justifying it in a sense. But it's like, perhaps I've been preparing for something like this all my life, not that I would wish it on anybody. And that mum and dad were a big part of that. They raised me in a way that meant that I could face, almost any challenge and be able to handle it and deal with it. That was when I really sort of started to sort of realize that resilience, part of it is control what you can control. So I've had heart surgery. There's certain things I couldn't do at that time, right? I wasn't allowed to be physically active. I couldn't play contact sport. I couldn't do a whole heap of things, but I did all these other things. And by default, I was still enjoying life, and I grew up and I've had a happy, healthy life despite having, that sort of surgery. And hundreds of people do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's the reflection on other aspects of your life are important as well. You can get stuck on, this is what happened to mum and dad, but I didn't want that to define me. And I also didn't want that to define mum and dad, which is part of why I wrote the book as well. Is that this is what happened to them. I can't take that away from them. But that's not who they were.
Yeah. And it's interesting. That's what I started off asking you. Who were they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were good people.
Yeah.
And the way I answered that to you before, I said something similar at the time. So a few days after they passed away, Tony Abbott, who was the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, he rang me and to talk about mum and dad and what happened. And he asked the same question. He said, tell me about your parents. And I said, Tony, mum and dad were, I don't know where it came from, to be honest, but I said, mum and dad were hardworking Australians. They never asked for anything in their life, and I sort of said something along the lines of, they paid their taxes, they did all the things that they were supposed to do, never asked for anything. I said, but Tony, they need our help right now. Like, I'm asking you to go and, do what you can to sort of bring their bodies back and bring them home. Not just ours, but all the Australians. And
how many Australians were there?
There was 38 that called Australia home. So quite a lot. And, he, as the Prime Minister of the day, he was very genuine, very compassionate, and gave a commitment to bringing people home. And that's exactly what they ended up doing. But that's how I describe them in that heat of the moment, whatever it is, that real sort of, the grief was raw at that stage. And it's true. They really didn't ask for anything. They were just good people.
If you've been listening today and something's resonated with you and you feel impacted or triggered by what you've heard, please reach out, because I'd love to walk with you on your journey and help you on the path to recovery. You can reach out to me via my website, empowerlifesolutions.com.au. I look forward to supporting you on your road to recovery. Matthew, how did that process? So it started with your phone call to Tony Abbott, and this is the next part that I wanted to go into, because what came after that was a very long, drawn-out procedure and a massive, long investigation with the federal police. So can you share a bit about what led on then from that conversation with Tony and how long everything took to take place?
Yeah, so at a family level, we were in constant contact with both DFAT and the Australian Federal Police. So both authorities had allocated staff and officers to us that were our liaison officers. So we had pretty much constant contact in terms of, especially with DFAT, it was daily contact at that stage. And the Federal Police was pretty regular as well. And they were supporting us and feeding us the information that they could at the time. There's a couple of things that sort of happened very quickly in that first week as well. One was led by Julie Bishop, who was the Foreign Affairs Minister for Australia at the time. And she also wrote the foreword in my book, which I'm very grateful for. But she was at the United Nations Security Council, travelled specifically over for that, and brokered what's known as Resolution 2166, which enabled access to the crash site to recover bodies, recover wreckage, and enable a full investigation to go ahead. And that was a critical piece of work for us. She was able to convince the Russian delegate on the United Nations Security Council to vote in favour of that resolution. So without going into it too much, there's some nations can veto a decision, and Russia is one of those nations. So it passed and it enabled access to the site in a controlled way. The site itself, which I've never been to, just simply because it's too unstable in that part of Ukraine, in fact, of all of Ukraine at the moment. But it had been a conflict zone since March 2014 and was really sort of led by Russian-backed insurgents that were sort of trying to take control of various parts of Ukraine and reclaim land back. Ultimately, they ordered, some heavier artillery, which was for shooting planes down, and they ultimately shut Mum and Dad's plane down. So the crash site was in a very unstable, war-torn sort of area.
Yeah.
Still is a war-torn area to this day. So that sort of Resolution 2166 and enabling people to get into the crash site was really, really important. And at the same time, because of the commitment that people like the Prime Minister and others had made, Australian personnel were deployed to, both Ukraine and the Netherlands to help in the recovery. And so those early days, I'll talk a lot about those early days because they were so important. Not only did they recover the bodies, but they also recovered different pieces of evidence and whatever else that ultimately would be used in the criminal trial. And so a lot of that was collected in those first few weeks, taken back to the Netherlands. The body identification process was a big setup. Again, it was led by a lot of Australian teams. We're good at victim identification is probably a good way of saying it. And that's on the back of things like the Bali bombings and the Boxing Day tsunami, where we've had, Australians impacted, but also helped our neighbouring nations with that process. So they were able to lead that side of things, and that sort of happened whilst the investigation started. They did stand up a joint investigation team, which included representatives from Australia and the Netherlands, along with some of the other nations. I think Malaysia and Germany were part of that. And it started a long process. So, that's it. 2014. Ultimately, there was enough evidence to sort of take it to court. There was a criminal trial in the Netherlands. And, if I jump forward a little bit, it sort of went through a whole process, obviously the whole legal process, which is draining and lengthy to start with. But the verdict came down in our favour, where 3 people were found guilty of shooting down the plane and murdering all those people. And that was handed down in November 2023.
My goodness, that's such a long, drawn-out investigation, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So it took, it was incredibly thorough. The Dutch legal system is very, very thorough. So done properly, done really well. But it wasn't until then that we had absolute confirmation that, yes, this is exactly what happened, who did it, how it happened, and confirmed in, a court of law that
Yeah.
was proof beyond reasonable doubt. And so it's a long time to live with kind of knowing what happened, but also wondering if it was something else or if there
Yeah.
was any other sort of scenario. So it was an important day for us and for all the families to sort of have that on record.
When that decision was handed down, was that a day of great relief for you, or was it a day knowing finally hearing the truth that those people were murdered, where anger really rose up in you?
I remember feeling a bit mixed, to be honest. It definitely had an aspect of relief because it had been confirmed through that court and legal process. But of course, it didn't change anything, right, in terms of what we've
Yeah.
been going through. So it doesn't, people often talk about things like providing closure and all that sort of stuff. I think it helps, but it's not finished, if that makes sense. I
Yeah.
still would like the relevant authorities, to take accountability for what they've done. And at this stage, that hasn't happened, even though it's been proven. There's still a lack of accountability around that.
Yeah, and you talked before about finding acceptance to help you go on.
Yeah, in terms of the decision, the legal decision, it helps with that acceptance a
Yeah.
little bit because I've got to that next piece that sort of says, yep, this confirms what happened. So now it takes away some of the doubt or whatever else, and so it does help accept. But also, I need to accept that the next bit might still take a while, and so that side of it, whilst the criminal trial's wrapped up and they handed down the verdict and they closed that matter, there's still other legal proceedings within the International Civil Aviation Organization and through the European Court of Human Rights, two separate matters that are about holding Russia and others to account
Well,
for their actions. And so those matters are still going. So here we are 12 years later.
oh gosh.
And they're still going. So it gives you sort of an indication that if I want a quick answer and I get frustrated by that,
Yeah.
I'm going to be in a bad space.
Yeah.
So I need to sort of accept that it's going to take time and we let it run its course.
Matthew, how long did it take for them to bring the bodies back to Australia? And when did you get to actually say farewell to your parents?
It took about two months to bring them back. So which in under the circumstances ended up being very quick, even though that's certainly not normal, right? When someone passes away, you might organise a funeral within that next week or two and go through that process. So in the context of that, and that's sort of, I guess, typically in Australian culture around funerals. There's other cultures that have different
Yeah.
ways of saying goodbye. But those first few weeks, we had no idea really where they were. We were getting updates, but they hadn't been identified. We knew that bodies had been recovered. We knew that they'd been taken back to the Netherlands, and we knew they were going through the identification process. We'd done our bit at our end to participate in that in terms of providing DNA samples and, medical records and dental records and things like that, which might support an identification. We also ended up organising our own memorial service. Or actually, prior to that, there was a national memorial service in Melbourne and a national day of mourning. And then it was around the 15th of August, off the top of my head, that we had held our memorial service. So that was at Eaton's Hill on the outskirts of Brisbane there. About 700 people turned up. It was, a bit of a celebration of mum and dad and not a typical funeral, but a typical elements of what might be at a funeral. But we needed to sort of do something. We felt like we needed to do something. But it was the night of that service that we got a call from the federal police to say they'd identified one of the bodies, and 5 days later they'd identified the second one. It was about 2 weeks after that we'd sort of pretty much travelled over to Europe immediately following that news, and But it was about 2 weeks after that we did the repatriation service and brought them home. So we were sort of reunited with them. When I say we, it was my two brothers and I.
Yeah.
Reunited with them in Amsterdam, and then did that. The Australian Air Force flew them home in the back of a C-17, one of the Air Force aircraft. And, those moments, that was a hard moment. Absolutely. The first time I saw those two caskets in Amsterdam was probably one of the saddest moments for me personally. And, we weren't supposed to be reunited that way, but, the way the Australian government did it and supported us was really, really, really important. So that repatriation flight, mum and dad came home together. They'd lived all their lives together, travelled together, and we were able to bring them home together. And, so they flew into Melbourne. We met them in Melbourne. All the Australian families went through Melbourne. So the Victorian coroner processed the dead bodies when they came back. And then ultimately, once that had been done, they were flying back up to Brisbane for us and finally sort of handed to a funeral director that we were working with to do our funeral. And the funeral was held on the 25th of September.
Oh, right.
So the accident was 17th of July.
Yeah.
So 25th of September. And, we mum and dad's wishes were to have the ashes scattered just off Mooloolaba there, at sea off Mooloolaba there. And
right. Which is
so
where we had the book. You had your book launch.
we did, yes. So they were there for the book launch. But we didn't do that until 9th of May 2025. So, there was some time that passed before we sort of did that. So, yeah, so that kind of, I have a way of sort of lengthening out my stories, but that kind of gives you an idea.
It's not a story that can be told in a short period of time. So you're doing so well to be able to share with us what you can in the limited amount of time that we have.
Yeah.
Did you say at your book launch too that your parents had always said that they wanted to die together?
Probably not quite like that. They were prepared for death. And this is a good life lesson for everyone, but logistically and everything, all the affairs were in order, which made it a lot easier for us to sort of deal with the estate. But yeah, not necessarily that they wanted to die together, but I think we might have, under the circumstances, it was good that they're together rather than one was still alive and one wasn't. Yeah.
Can you just quickly tell us about the sunflowers? Because that's just such an amazing part of the story which continues to live on as a legacy of this tragic event.
Yeah, we talk about, the nice things that people do and that, they want to help, right? And so it started with an Australian journalist who was working for the Sydney Morning Herald at the time. His name's Paul McGeoch. And a photographer, Kate Garrity, who was also over there. And they spent a fair bit of time in eastern Ukraine covering the story. They were on the ground, which is incredibly brave in itself to sort of do that. Of course, lots of journalists do that, but, they did a great job. And where the large sections of the crash site were sunflower fields in that part of eastern Ukraine. So, we're talking those big sort of European ones that stand as tall as a person and have, a sunflower head as big as a face. So, certainly was an important commodity for them in that part of the world. And before Paul left, he took 3 sunflower heads. He was US based. So he took 3 sunflower heads, took them back to his home and wanted to offer the seeds to family members, Australian family members. So he wrote an article in the Sydney Morning Herald and said, look, I've got these seeds and, get in touch if you would like some. I'll send them to you. And I, like a lot of other families, got in touch and said, yep, that would be wonderful. That's a little bit of Ukraine that we can have because we haven't been over there. And sunflowers give that hope. They're happy sort of flowers, if you like. And, there's a lot to like about them. So they're easy to grow and all of that. But of course, nothing was as straightforward as it could be. Our quarantine laws are pretty tough, and Australian quarantine sort of got wind of what was going on and sort of said to Paul, look, no, you're not sending those flowers, those seeds to everybody. However, what they did do, they said, look, if you're happy to, send them to us. We will grow them out in a controlled environment within our lab in Australia, test them for any sort of disease or insects or whatever else that we don't want in Australia. And if it's all good, we'll pass them on to the families. So they did do that. They grew them out in the labs and the seeds were fine. They were great. So they distributed those seeds to the families. And I remember I got a little packet of seeds to grow. I'll never forget, I got 17 seeds in the packet. 17's a number, right? The flight number was MH17. They died on the 17th. And I planted them all. I grew these sunflowers and it was great. And then I would harvest those seeds and I grew some more. And so I was telling this story at a talk I did for Mark Forbes and Ed, the charity I'm now on. And I talked about, I call it the Seeds of Hope. And Ed has a charity about hope as well. And after the talk, Mark sort of said, oh, look, why don't we try and grow them in our House of Hope? The people who come in and receive treatment for eating disorders, when they leave, they can get a small packet of seeds and, gives them hope, gives them something to grow. Very positive sort of experience. So we said that's how that started. By now we're talking, my 17 seeds are now thousands of seeds.
Isn't that just so amazing?
We started selling them as small packets of seeds for $10, and that money goes to Ed to support, the charity work that they do. And it's been going ever since. And my seeds are going everywhere. But it's been terrific. And we sold them on the book launch. We raised $1,000 for charity that day.
Oh.
Such a simple sort of gesture, but it actually has a lot of meaning. And I think when I reflect on this, it's more than just selling seeds. I feel like we're selling a little bit of hope as well. So the people who get them know the story, and it's just a lot more than a simple sunflower seed. It actually has a lot of meaning for a lot of people, and it's been terrific.
Yeah, out of something so tragic has come something so beautiful.
Absolutely, and I'm really proud that we can kind of keep it going. There's a nice garden bed at the House of Hope now that's in the shape of a heart. And those flowers grow there. Yeah.
I'm sure your mum and dad would just be looking down, just thinking that was so wonderful.
Yeah, I hope so. I think so. Yeah. Of course.
Matthew, as we close now, what's your message for the world?
Oh, well, that's a good question, isn't it? That whole sunflower story and that there is hope is a very good message for the world as well. But, it's easy in hindsight, of course, but, I've got a lot more perspective on life and certainly, make the most of every moment, really, and including spending time with, your loved ones and your family members and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes it's really easy in the busyness of life to push things aside, but at the same time, it's not actually hard to not push them aside and make the little bit of extra effort. So, yeah, and one of the things Mum always used to say, which resonates a lot, but she'd say, don't sweat the small stuff. And so, it connects to that same sort of message. It's like, okay, you need to recognize what is small stuff, of course, but, we do get caught up on little things and sometimes they're not that important. So focus on the bigger things.
Oh, that's great. Well, Matthew, thank you so much. You are such a wonderful, inspirational human, and the way that you have continued to give back to others and your community in the midst of your own adversity is just truly inspiring. So thank you so much for sharing your story of hope with us today.
Yeah, look, not a problem at all. Thanks for having me on, Kerry. It's been lovely to chat.
Thank you for listening to Stories of Hope with Kerry Atherton. If this conversation helped you, please consider sharing the podcast with a friend or leaving a rating and review on your podcast player. If you'd like to find out more about Kerry Atherton, head to storiesofhope.com.au, where you can purchase her books or find her next event. Check the show notes for links and information about our guest in this episode, and remember, you don't have to walk your path alone.